Hi guys! So with what we left off last week, by the 3rd and the 4th century, the mighty Roman Empire was plagued with civil war, financial collapse, famines, pestilence, and the church at that time was also undergoing many changes to its law and was ruled with the Nicene Creed. Now, beside being faced with the military and religious strife, the Germanic tribe had exerted pressure on the frontier of the Roman Empire since the late 3rd century.
Well, with what we are describing and laying this out on the timelines, we actually see this period and onwards recorded in the book of Daniel chapter 7. And according to the word of the angel to Daniel, there was to be a period where someone was to hold supremacy over the saints, times, and the laws of the Most High.
So today we'll look into this key period that traverses mankind and the church history, impacting the world since then until today. So let's flip open the Bible at Daniel chapter 7, verse 23 to 25. Verse 23 says, "Thus it said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings which shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous word against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change time and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, and times, and half a time." Now the fourth beast here refers to no other than the Roman Empire, with its detailed characteristics have been found recorded in Daniel chapter 2 verse 40 and Daniel chapter 7 verse 7.
Well, in verse 24, we see that the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. Now, we have already established that this kingdom means the Roman Empire. So who are the 10 horns? Actually, the 10 horns here represent 10 Germanic tribes which entered, invaded, and established rule within the Western Roman Empire, dividing it into 10. Well, we will be discussing more about the horns in greater detail in our Trumpets of Revelation series. So actually this entire period, it's happened across AD 260 and 596. It's across 3 centuries. And a final strike actually led the last Roman emperor in the West to be removed from his power. And this was the year of the downfall, which is AD 476. Marking the end of the great Roman Empire. So the period that we are talking about after this fall is termed the Middle Ages.
And so the Middle Ages were a period of about 1,000 years in the European history, starting from the year AD 476. Right. So why is it termed the Middle Ages? It is because this is the time between the fall of the Imperial Rome and the beginning of the early modern Europe, the Renaissance. This period is also known as the Medieval Age. The Dark Ages lasted for hundreds of years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a time of chaos and poverty without the central government to maintain order. And of course, it's also known as the Age of Faith because this is the period of time where we see the rise of Christianity and Islam.
Well, the Middle Ages is critically important both for Europe and also for mankind's history because this period was plagued with conspiracy and power manipulations, bloody massacres, deadly epidemics, crusades and inquisitions that truly mark an era of darkness. And actually, we have already learned in our previous episode that prelude to this period, Satan, through Constantine, created a new pagan religion of Christianity, which is the Roman Catholic. So it is within this period, 1,000 years within the church history, that continues to pave the way for a darker and a distorted intensification of the power of the Roman Catholic Church.
Now, since denomination didn't really exist in the Middle Ages, there was only one church, which is the Roman Catholic Church. Now, during the Middle Age, we refer to the church actually as the Catholic Church. Right. Now, the only institute that survived the collapse of the Roman power was that church. Although there was many different Christian sects that actually happens in the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius I made Catholic Christianity the official religion of the empire with the Edict of Thessalonica in AD 380. The church appeared as the new dominant power of Europe. Like the Romans, they had their capital in Rome. They had their own emperor, the Pope.
Well, even with the newly decreed state religion, Christians in those days were confused and they were obsessive as they were so involved in doctrinal disputes that evangelism means winning someone to your side of the argument. So they were just as a people groping in the darkness with only sparks of their own kindled fire, with no true light of Christ and His words guiding them. Well, so in the early 4th to 5th centuries, monasticism developed and thrived. So this monasticism emphasized on a denial of the worldly pleasures and commitment to devote one's life to just studying the scriptures. And this monastic life was guided by the rule of Saint Benedict, which was a practice that had spread from the 4th century from Egypt to all parts of the Christian world. And actually, men and women who lived as religious solitaries were held in particularly high esteem.
Now, along with this monasticism, Arianism was also coveted and largely sought after. It is a religion as political as Romanism itself. The fact that Arians deny the deity of Christ is sufficient to prove that Arianism was essentially paganism in the guise of Christianity. Now, what we mentioned is the tip of the iceberg of a myriad of divergent views and heresies. The church was struggling for universal acceptance as authority figure in a divided empire, while internally arguing for how to define what the church actually believes. Now, in the face of religious schism and ineffective imperial power, a powerful and authoritative figure was necessary to avoid the collapse of the whole church. Now, how to unify the Roman Empire in both civil and religious function then?
So let us take a look at verse 24 further. And another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones and shall subdue 3 kings. So here, this new power that will arise must be different. It must not be a political power, and it must be a religious power. So let us look today at a key figure that will answer to all these uncertainties.
And today we're going to look at this person called Justinian. Now, the Emperor Justinian I was the Eastern Roman Emperor from the time AD 527 to AD 565, and he had great ambitions. Now, early into his reign, he rewrote the Roman law and regulated everything, both in religion and as well as in law. Now, remember that Roman emperors are also known as the Pontifex Maximus, meaning to say that they not only have the political leaders, they are also called as the head priests, spiritual leaders.
And it was in the year AD 533, Justinian in his decree addressed the Pope as being the head of all the churches, and that all affairs touching from the church shall be referred just to the Pope, which is the true and effective corrector of heretics. Well, so we can see that actually similarly to Constantine, Justinian crossed the barrier of his mandate between what is purely civil and religious, decreeing this Justinian code that is mixed with Christianity and state affairs. And Justinian and his quest for unification of the empire by the church, or also the persecution of the enemies of the church and heretics, and also with his disdain for the Sabbath, he wanted full control, and this actually opened the way for the development of the unhindered papal power.
Now in verse 24 also say that he shall subdue 3 kings. Now the Bible indicates the 3 kings will be destroyed as the papacy power establishes power and authority. Now true enough, history recorded the fulfillment of this prophecy as Pope Vigilius put pressure on the Roman Emperor Justinian to liquidate the 3 kings who resisted the papal authority and encroachment. Now this was at the year 538. Now therefore, by the year 538, the papal supremacy was publicly acknowledged as head of all church, and ever since then, the Pope assumed the title of Vicegerent of Jesus Christ, a person regarded as an earthly representative of God, especially titled as the Pope. When we examine the papal power in the conjunctions of Daniel chapter 7 verse 8, it precisely identified the little horn as the man of sin, the Antichrist power.
And further, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 4, it further describes this beast or the Antichrist power. It says here, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, did actually anyone there exalt himself as God? Let us take a look at the quotes of some of the popes. Pope Pius V blasphemed that the Pope and God are the same, so he has all power in heaven and earth. And also Pope Pius IX said, I alone am the successor of the apostles, the vicar of Jesus Christ. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So there you go, it fittingly describes the actions of the beast or the Antichrist power which have been fulfilled by the popes of Rome. And further, we see this in Daniel chapter 7 verse 25, where he says, He shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High and shall intend to change times and laws. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time.
Now we already know that this timeline to this prophecy begins in the year 538. Now verse 25 is crucial for us to determine how long this power reigns continues. And so the prophetic period of this a time, times, and half a time is also known as 3.5 years, has been historically understood as comprising a period during the Middle Ages.
So this is the same as a 1260 years time period as a 1260 days in Revelation 11, and the time, times, and half a time of Revelation 12, and also the 42 months of Revelation 13. They are the same. So using the day-year principle in the Bible prophecy, the little horn or the papal supremacy would reign supreme for 1260 years throughout the centuries of the Middle Ages. And through the influence of the Christian Reformation in the 16th century, the persecution was then brought to an end in 1798.
As we continue to look at verse 25, here says, shall persecute the saint of the Most High and shall intend to change times and law. Now in AD 538, it is a very important year as it marks the beginning of the power and authority of the papal supremacy. Now over 1,000 years, this papal power substitutes human traditions for God's word, man's law for God's law, and penance and indulgence prescribed by the church for the forgiveness and repentance prescribed by God.
And we know that churches today are actually primarily religious institutions, but the Catholic Church then, in the Middle Ages, held tremendous political power. So those people who held contrary ideas were considered as heretics, and they could be subjected to punishments, for example, execution. And many Christians in that period who refused to yield to this power were actually persecuted.
Now, thus, the year 538 become a turning point in the history of papacy. No power in Rome can be said to rule over the earth except the ecclesiastical pontifical power, and this produced a paradigm shift from pagan Rome to the church and the papal function.
Now actually the Pope in those times were just like the supreme ruler of Europe. Even the kings and queens then subject themselves to this papal authority, and those who did not risked the wrath of the church. So this Pope not only claims the right, and as far as possible, he has exercised the authority to not only appoint pastors, teachers, priests, bishops, but also both to depose kings and to set up kings.
Now, as a result, the Pope were free to do as they pleased with no authority over them, to discipline them for the evil which they have committed. Now, they are supposedly to be Christ's representative on earth, the so-called Most Holy Father and the Vicar of Christ. It is not uncommon to hear that Pope fathers multiple illegitimate children and keeping mistresses and living in open sin. Now, corruption has spread through both head and the members of the hierarchy of the Roman Church at that time.
As Christianity was the center of life then, the church actually used their power and authority to their advantage, finding ways to charge people at every opportunity they have. For example, paying for sacraments such as baptism. And to the people then actually, if they were not baptized, they were unable to pass through the gates of heaven. So they were willing to pay the money. And also with the sale of indulgences, which are papers which declared absolution from sins, even for those not committed.
Now, with such rampant immorality and corruptions during the Dark Ages, righteousness and holiness were attributes unmentioned and largely ignored by the churches. It was indeed a gloomy period for the institute that was supposed to be Christ's visible witness on earth.
As the ruling church and papacy rose in power in Europe, what came out from the church was darkness that enveloped the whole of Europe. It was 1,000 years lost in this dark void between the bright lights of the early church and the Reformation. So corruption, doctrinal declension, and immorality swept through the church, causing this period to also known as the Dark Ages of Christianity. So it was dark because the light of the gospel of Christ was almost entirely extinguished, and because of the darkness of sin that had pervaded all the ranks of the church, from the Pope all the way down to the common folks.
Now, until the Christian Reformations in the 16th century, there was no question that the church in the Middle Ages are facing daunting challenges such as widespread or Bible illiteracy, cultural syncretisms, a society steeped in violence and persecutions, disparity between the rich and the poor. Church leaders often more concerned with power, influence, and prestige than ministering to their own flocks. Political leaders are more than happy to go off with the church for their own benefits.
Now, does that sound familiar to us today? It was a time like that, it actually challenges even the most faithful Christian, right? But if we actually look closely enough, we will see the church struggling through many of the same issues that we actually face today. Doesn't it remind us that what happens when people are ignorant of the truth? And however, though many were deceived during this time of their ignorance of truth, many more still strove for faithfulness in a time of this darkened world.
Now, despite the gloom, it wasn't a time which faithful Christians virtually disappeared. Now, did you see how this amazing prophecy actually accurately predicts and at the same time records in the book of Daniel, century even before this age? Now, this is our sovereignty of God, that only He is the author, He's the finisher who decrees all things.